It is 1857. In Paris, a young Russian aristocrat pushes through a crowd to watch a man be guillotined. The blade falls, a head drops into a basket. The Russian is overcome by a sudden, violent nausea. That single, brutal moment will set him out on a path to dismantle the system he was born into and ignite a radical vision that will eventually bring entire empires to their knees. Tonight, we unravel the life of Leo Tolstoy. He produced works that redefined the limits of literature, capturing the brutal sweep of history and deepest mechanics of the human heart. By 41, he'd secured unparalleled adulation and wealth, cementing his status at the summit of the literary world. Then, perhaps most remarkably, he threw it all away. He turned his back on his wealth to preach a severe brand of Christian anarchism. He paid for this defiance. He was kicked out of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the strain destroyed his 50-year marriage. The sacrifice, however, secured his true legacy. His doctrine of non-violent defiance would directly influence the likes of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and armed future generations with the tools to dismantle oppressive regimes across the world. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us fight against algorithmic censorship. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, settle in as we journey back to the deep forests of 19th century Russia to meet a man who wrote the world into being and then tried to save it by throwing his own life away. This is the bedtime biography of Leo Tolstoy. Chapter 1. Yasnaya Polyana. The name of the estate means clear glade. It comes from a gap in the old forest barricades, the ones raised in the 16th century to slow the Tatar riders who came from the south. A small opening in the trees, then a house, then a world. It was called Yasnaya Polyana, and it would become the center of young Leo Tolstoy's universe in every sense that word can hold. He was born there, and he would one day flee from there, and he would be buried there in a simple mound without a cross. But all of that is still to come. For now, we begin in the late 1700s with a grandfather and a grudge. The maternal grandfather, a general, proud and difficult, who once fell out with Prince Potemkin himself. Rather than bend to Catherine the Great's favorite, he left the army. He went home, took his honor with him, and poured it into the land. He built a classical manor house at the highest point of the estate, with a grand portico held up by 8 columns and 2 matching wings joined by wooden decking. He laid out formal French gardens and engineered a series of small ponds that fell one into the next. There were greenhouses where peaches ripened in the Russian cold, and a surf orchestra trained from childhood that played Haydn in the cool of the morning. It was a little kingdom, patriarchal and self-sufficient, and it ran on the labor of people who were, in the eyes of the law, owned. The other grandfather, on Tolstoy's father's side, was a different sort of man. He had oysters sent in from Holland. His linen, so the story goes, was sent all the way to Amsterdam to be laundered. He gambled and he mismanaged, and in time he emptied the family coffers almost entirely. The debts passed down, as debts do. His father inherited them along with the family name. That father had fought against Napoleon in 1812 and had been taken prisoner by the French and had come home to a pile of unpaid bills. He took a dull clerk's job to keep the household afloat. Then he married a wealthy heiress, older than him, and plain in the face, but brilliant in every other way. She was Leo Tolstoy's mother. She spoke 5 languages. She managed the estate with careful attention, and she once wrote a small story about a noblewoman freeing a serf, which tells you something about the shape of her mind. Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born on the 28th of August, 1828, on an old leather couch made by one of the estate's own serfs. That same couch would later witness the births of his own children. It would turn up, in one form or another, in the pages of his novels. Leo, as he is known in English, was the youngest of 4 sons, raised in a house full of eccentric relatives and some 30 servants. His mother died when he was 2. He had no real memory of her face, which meant he could imagine it as he wished, and he wished her perfect. In his diaries, years later, he would write of longing for her, of wanting to curl up somewhere and be held by a woman he had never really known. She became, for him, the shape of unconditional love. His father took the center of his early life instead, a charming and stubborn man who drew lovely pictures, hunted with his borzoi dogs, and refused to grovel before any official in any office. The children were also raised by aunts. One was deeply religious, giving away her money in secret, drifting between monasteries, filling the house with wandering holy fools and pilgrims. Another aunt, quietly in love with his father and never loved back in the way she hoped, became the emotional anchor of his childhood. She taught young Leo, he would later say, the spiritual pleasure of love, though she taught it by living, not by speaking of it. He was a tender child. They called him the Howler, because he wept so easily, moved by a line of poetry, a piece of music, or the distress of an animal. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain direct voting rights on future topics and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Every so often, the truth of the place slipped through. One afternoon, Leo watched a kindly middle-aged coachman being led to the threshing barn to be flogged. The steward walked him across the yard. The boy watched. The serfs who played Haydn in the mornings were the same serfs who could be beaten in the afternoons. It was all one estate, and it was all, in its way, his. Against this, there was the green stick. Leo's eldest brother, whom he adored, invented a game. Somewhere in the woods nearby, the brother said a small green stick had been buried. Carved into that stick was the secret to universal human happiness. If it could ever be found and lifted from the earth, all sickness would end, and all anger would fade, and every person on earth would become an ant brother huddled together in love. The boy believed it, in the way children believe things. The idea of the ant brothers sank into him and stayed there, underneath everything else, for the rest of his life. In 1837, the family packed up for Moscow so the older boys could be educated there. 7 carriages and a closed sleigh rolled out from the estate in a slow, creaking caravan. A few months later, walking down a street in Tula, Leo's father collapsed and died of a stroke. The boy was 9. For a long time afterwards, he scanned the faces in Moscow crowds, half expecting to see his father among them, walking toward him. A grandiloquent French tutor arrived next, who locked him in a room and threatened him with the rod and planted in him a lasting horror of coercion. He answered this with strange, reckless defiance. Once he jumped from a second-story window, convinced for a moment that he might fly, and knocked himself out cold on the ground below. Then his grandmother died, and he was made to kiss the cold hands of her corpse. The innocence of childhood was, by then, thoroughly used up. The money ran out almost at once. The Moscow household was broken up, the siblings scattered between relatives, the small luxuries stripped away. Their postilion, who had traveled with them in a fine uniform, was sent back to the fields in bast shoes. Leo noticed the man's calm acceptance of this fall. There was no complaint, no anger, no self-pity. Something settled in him then, a first, half-formed sense that the peasants around him might know something about how to live that the nobility did not. Stripped of his parents and his first home, he was sent next to an aunt in a distant provincial capital, where the moral seriousness of his early years would unravel into something far more reckless. Chapter 2. The Young Tolstoy. In November of 1841, the orphan children were moved once again, this time eastward to the city of Kazan. Their new guardian was their Aunt Polina, a woman whose days revolved around the small social triumphs of provincial aristocratic life. She cared deeply about invitations, about dresses, about which families called upon which. The household hummed with a kind of polished emptiness. And it was into this world that Leo stepped as a boy of 13, already shadowed by loss, already watching himself from a slight distance as though he were his own severe witness. Looking back on these years much later, he would describe them without mercy. He called it a time of crude, dissolute living, spent in the service of ambition, of vanity, and above all, of lust. The phrase is his own, written in his own hand, and he meant every word of it. What followed across the next 2 decades was less a youth than a long argument with himself. At the university, he enrolled first in the Faculty of Oriental Languages, imagining himself a diplomat of some vague future brilliance. The imagining did not survive contact with the coursework. What bored him, he refused to study. Failure followed. Law came next, where he failed in the subtler way by not quite caring. What absorbed him instead was the cut of his coat, the shape of his chin, and the question of whether he was, in the French phrase he worshipped, comme il faut. Once, in a fit of strange hope, he shaved his eyebrows off entirely, convinced they would return thicker, more commanding. They did not. His older brother had already introduced him, at 14, to the brothels of the town. What stays with a man from such a moment? For him, everything. The room, the silence after, standing beside her bed, weeping, unable to stop. He stood beside the woman's bed afterwards and wept, and could not stop weeping. It was the beginning of a pattern he would never quite escape, a motion between appetite and shame, between the body's wants and the soul's horror at having wanted. Around this time, he discovered Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the discovery was total. He read all 20 volumes. He wore a medallion with the philosopher's portrait around his neck, in the place where an orthodox cross would normally have hung. Rousseau's arguments against civilization, against the pieties of church and class, settled into him like weather. I did more than admire him, Leo confessed years later. I worshipped him. In the spring of 1847, confined to the university clinic for a venereal illness, he began a diary. The blank page became a sort of courtroom. He wrote rules for himself, strict daily schedules modeled on Benjamin Franklin, instructions as granular as do exercise every day and do not have women. He broke nearly all of them, nearly always. Then he wrote down that he had broken them, and devised new ones. Disgusted with rote learning, Leo dropped out before finishing his degree, and returned to Yasnaya Polyana at 19, the absolute master of hundreds of serfs. He tried, briefly, to be enlightened. He designed a one-piece garment that buttoned from the inside, an ascetic uniform of his own invention, and wore it while visiting aristocrats looked on in polite alarm. He eavesdropped on the peasants to understand their lives. The experiment collapsed. He drifted between bouts of reading, long afternoons of doing nothing at all, and the young serf women of his estate, whom he desired and then despised himself for desiring. When the countryside grew unbearable, he fled to Moscow and then to Petersburg, where he lost staggering sums at cards. Whole villages of his inheritance were sold to cover the debts. Entire forests gone in a night. He wrote to his brother in stunned self-contempt. "I set off for no reason to Petersburg," he admitted. "Did nothing worthwhile there. Just spent a heap of money and got into debt. It is unbelievably stupid." What saved him, or at least redirected him, was the gypsy music of the taverns, and then, more decisively, the South. In 1851, with his creditors closing in, he followed his older brother Nikolai to the Caucasus. He arrived at a Cossack settlement on the Terek River, a place of hunting, of horses, of sudden violence, and of men who seemed to him unreasonably free. He befriended an 80-year-old Cossack named Epishka, who taught him the old songs, and a young Chechen whom he once defended, with his fists, from cheating Russian officers at cards. He volunteered for forest clearing raids against the mountain rebels and learned what it felt like to be shot at. He enlisted formally as an artillery cadet, but he kept his distance from the other officers, whose drunkenness bored him. He fenced. He played chess. He read alone. "How did I end up here?" he asked his diary. "I don't know. And why am I here? Also I don't know." And then, in the long, ill, homesick months at the spa town of Pyatigorsk, Leo began to write. He drafted and redrafted a short novel called Childhood and sent it, unsigned, to the most important literary journal in Russia. The reply came back, filled with praise. Something in him lifted that would never quite settle again. When the censors altered his title and cut his text, he was furious. But the work appeared, and the public was stunned. "Call things by their name," he had written to himself while composing it. It was a small instruction. It would become the ground of everything he did afterwards. Still, the frontier had begun to feel small. The raids, the card games, the long evenings with the Pishka, none of it could hold him now that he had tasted the strange, addictive thing that was literary acclaim. And so, restless once more, he began to look westward, toward the imperial clash brewing on the Danube, a war that would eventually pull him into the grinding slaughter of the Crimean Peninsula. Chapter 3. Sevastopol and the Horror of War. In the early months of 1854, Leo received orders that would change the course of his life. He was transferred to the Danube front, to the active war between the Russian Empire and the combined forces of Britain, France, and the Ottomans. The young officer, who had written of Cossack villages and mountain streams, was now bound for something far heavier. He arrived at the long siege of Silistria, and what he saw there began to dismantle him. The imperial army, for all its pageantry, was disorganized and slow. Orders contradicted one another. Supplies failed to arrive. Whatever lingering notions he held about military precision crumbled gently in the dust of that first campaign. The Russians eventually pulled back from the Danube, and Leo, restless as ever, requested a transfer to the Crimean Peninsula. His reasons were tangled. There was patriotism, certainly. There was also the writer's hunger for material, and the gambler's hope that a medal or two might help settle the debts still hanging around his neck. By November of that same year, he arrived in Sevastopol, a fortified port on the Black Sea that was steadily becoming something closer to a slaughterhouse. The Allied guns had ringed the city, and their bombardment fell day and night. He was assigned to the 4th Bastion, the most exposed position in the Russian line, a place where men measured their lives in hours. The conditions there are difficult to describe without flinching. Deep, freezing mud underfoot, the constant roar of artillery overhead, a stench made of rotting bodies, black powder, and the waste of frightened men. Leo lived in a damp earth dugout, sharing close quarters with the conscripted peasant soldiers who made up most of the garrison. He watched them closely. His hypersensitive nature, which had tormented him since boyhood, now absorbed every terrible detail of what was happening around him. He saw men torn apart by cannon fire at close range, bodies reduced to fragments in a heartbeat. He did not look away. When others visited the hospitals, the amputations without anesthetic, the floors soaked with blood, buckets filled with severed limbs, he did not look away. He visited the makeshift hospitals, too, where the pioneering surgeon Nikolai Pirogov worked through the nights. Amputations were performed quickly, brutally, often without proper anesthetic. The floors were soaked through with blood. Buckets filled with severed limbs sat waiting to be carried out. Young men lay pale on their cots, some dying slowly of infection, others of the slow bleed that no one could stop in time. Leo watched, and he wrote. Despite dysentery, despite exhaustion, despite the shells that never seemed to pause, he kept his diaries. He recorded the smallest flickers of fear and cowardice in himself and in the officers beside him. He wrote a letter to his brother around this time, declaring that the spirit of the troops was beyond all description, that there had never been so much heroism. The patriotic fervor was genuine. It was also temporary. As the months dragged on, that feeling dissolved into something far more caustic. He began to channel his experiences into a series of short pieces, written almost in real time, and dispatched to the literary journal Sovremennik in the capital. These became the Sevastopol sketches. The first, titled Sevastopol in December, reads like an immersive tour of the besieged city. Leo speaks directly to his reader. He walks you into the hospital. He makes you smell it. This was a detonation. The entire romantic tradition of war writing, with its charging cavalry and noble deaths, collapsed under the weight of what he described. In its place, he offered grinding fear, endless boredom, and the small humiliations that follow a man under fire. The second sketch, Sevastopol in May, went further still. He turned his attention to the officers themselves, dissecting their vanity and their petty social games, the way some of them treated the siege as a stage for advancing their careers. He traced the exact thoughts of a man watching a mortar shell land at his feet, the seconds before detonation, the desperate arithmetic of survival. The sketches caused a sensation in St. Petersburg. Leo became a celebrity overnight while still huddled in a muddy dugout under enemy fire. The new Tsar, Alexander II, is said to have read the first sketch with tears in his eyes, ordering it translated into French and directing that the young author be moved somewhere safer. The third sketch, Sevastopol in August, followed the final days of the siege, the devastating retreat, and the senseless deaths of two brothers who embodied the futility of it all. At the close of the second sketch, Leo set down the line that would guide him for the rest of his working life. "The hero of my tale," he wrote, "whom I love with all the strength of my soul, is truth." He left the ruined city in late 1855, carrying a permanent disgust for the machinery that had produced such suffering. The anti-war philosophy that would eventually culminate in "The Kingdom of God is Within You," some 40 years later, was already present in these trench observations, waiting. He had seen how the state depended on a romanticized story of violence to convince ordinary men to kill one another, and that recognition never left him. He boarded a train for the imperial capital, carrying his trauma straight into the drawing rooms of Petersburg society. The celebrated literary hero would soon discover the salons disgusted him just as much as the command tents he had left behind. Chapter 4. War and Peace. Leo arrived in St. Petersburg in the final weeks of 1855, a decorated veteran with ink on his fingers and mud still somewhere in his boots. The city's literary circle opened its doors at once. The writers of the Sovremenic, polished and progressive and fluent in 3 or 4 languages, welcomed him as the great hope of Russian letters. They were certain they had found their man. He, for his part, was not certain he wanted to be found. He thanked them with contempt. Where they wore finely cut European suits, he wore coarse military tunics or peasant shirts that looked as if they had been pulled from an old trunk. It was a costume, and it was a provocation, and everyone in the room understood it. He picked fights. He sneered at their aesthetics. He seemed to take particular pleasure in being impossible. The deepest of these quarrels was with Ivan Turgenev, the reigning giant of Russian prose. Turgenev was refined, liberal, beautifully mannered, and everything the younger writer could not abide. Their arguments went on for years, gathering heat. Eventually, the heat became something worse. Leo challenged Turgenev to a duel with hunting rifles and meant, in that moment, to kill him. The duel never happened, but the friendship did not survive it, and the 2 men would not speak for nearly 2 decades. In 1856, he resigned his commission, finished with the army, and mostly finished with the literary salons too. He wanted to see the wider world. Across 1857, and again between 1860 and 1861, he traveled. Germany, France, Switzerland, England. He went with a notebook and a scowl, scrutinizing schools and prisons and parliaments, looking for the civilization everyone kept promising him. On a bright April morning in Paris in 1857, Leo pushed into the crowd outside the Roquette prison. A man named Francois Richard was to be guillotined for murder. The blade hung suspended. A beat, 2. Then the wet snap of a neck giving way, and the specific sound, he would never forget it, of a human head dropping into a wicker basket. That evening, in his diary, he wrote that something inside him had shifted for good. The state, he decided, was simply a large and well-oiled machine for killing people. He would not forget the sound. The schools he visited in France and Germany revolted him almost as deeply. Rows of small children reciting in unison, beaten for inattention, drilled into obedience. He saw factories, not classrooms. He came home to Yasnaya Polyana with a plan. The school he opened for the peasant children on his estate was unlike anything Russia had seen. No grades, no punishments, no register even. The children came when they wanted and left when they wanted. They sprawled on the floor, read Pushkin and Victor Hugo aloud, argued with their teachers, and wrote their own stories in voices so fresh he could hardly believe it. He started a journal to defend the method. The educated classes, he insisted, had far more to learn from the peasants than the peasants did from them. In September of 1862, the restless bachelor proposed to Sofia Andreevna Bears, the 18-year-old daughter of a Moscow doctor. Leo was 34. He adored her. And on the eve of the wedding, he handed her his bachelor diaries and asked her to read them. He believed it would purify him. It did not. She read about the brothels, about the affairs, about Aksinya, the peasant woman on the estate who had borne him a son. She wept through the night. The wound never really closed, and the marriage began with it already inside. Still, the early years were productive in the way only a certain kind of painful domestic intensity can be. Leo had a wife who believed in his genius, a house full of children arriving in steady succession, and an idea that would not leave him alone. He had meant to write a novel about the Decembrist rebels of 1825. The research kept pulling him backwards, towards Napoleon, towards 1812, towards the burning of Moscow. War and Peace began appearing in serial form in 1865 and stood complete in all its enormous bulk by 1869. Sophia copied the manuscript out by hand, over and over, often late into the night, often pregnant. His handwriting was nearly unreadable. She read it anyway. The book took the great man theory of history and took it apart, page by page. Napoleon, in his telling, was a vain little fool who understood nothing of the events he supposedly commanded. The true hero was Kutuzov, the old Russian general, precisely because Kutuzov knew he controlled almost nothing. History, the novel argued, was made from below by the uncounted small movements of millions of ordinary people who had no idea what they were building. It was a deeply democratic vision, and a proto-anarchist one, smuggled inside a family saga about balls and love affairs. Prince Andrei finds his meaning only when he is dying. Pierre Bezukhov, stumbling and earnest, finds his in the serene face of a peasant prisoner named Platon Karataev. The search for how to live runs underneath every page. When it was finished, Leo was the most famous writer in the world. The money poured in, the children multiplied, the estate hummed. He had, by every visible measure, arrived. And something in him, very faintly at first, had already begun to come undone. Chapter 5. Anna Karenina and the Abyss. The certainties that had carried Leo through his 30s were wearing thin, and he could feel it, the way a man feels the weather changing before the rain. He sat down to begin a new book and found that he could not. For a time, he tried to write about Peter the Great. The project collapsed under its own weight because the more he read about the Tsar, the more he recoiled from the man's cruelty and autocratic violence. He put the notes aside and turned his attention instead to the present day, to the restless, modernizing Russia unfolding all around him. The beginning, when it finally came, arrived by accident. One afternoon in 1873, he picked up a volume of Pushkin's prose and began to read. He admired the way Pushkin started a story already in motion, without preamble, without apology. Inspired, he sat down and drafted a scene of guests arriving at a country house for the evening, and from that small seed, the new novel began to grow. Something else had lodged itself in his mind around the same time. A neighboring landowner's mistress, a woman named Anna Pirogova, had thrown herself under a freight train after her lover abandoned her. He traveled to the local railway station to see the body for himself. What he witnessed there stayed with him, and slowly, almost without his noticing, it began to shape the heroine who would bear her name. On the surface, Anna Karenina looked like an elegant society novel about an adulterous affair. Underneath, it was something else entirely, an agonized inquiry into how a person might live a meaningful life in a corrupted world. The book was held together by a structural doubleness, two storylines running in careful parallel. Anna's affair descended slowly toward catastrophe, while the awkward landowner Konstantin Levin climbed just as slowly toward something resembling faith. Levin was the author in barely disguised form. Through him, Leo poured out his own agricultural obsessions, his social clumsiness, and his mounting hunger for spiritual truth. Levin's experiments on his estate, his tangled attempts to rethink the relationship between the educated landowner and the emancipated peasant, all of it reflected the writer's own unease about the wealth he had inherited and the people whose labor sustained it. In one of the most beautiful passages in the book, Levin joins his peasants in the fields to mow hay. The scythes move in rhythm. The sun climbs. For a stretch of hours, he forgets himself entirely, losing his anxious, chattering mind in the steady physical grace of the work. It is a small glimpse of the peace the writer was himself beginning to search for, though he did not yet have a name for it. The novel opened with a startling epigraph: "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." Those words were a refusal, a signal that the suffocating high society of St. Petersburg and Moscow had no moral authority to condemn Anna, and that judgment belonged to a higher power than theirs. Anna's destruction became a study in how a rigid patriarchal order crushes the women who step outside its narrow boundaries. His attitude toward her was more tender than later moralizing readings suggested. He gave her immense vitality and intelligence, and an inability to live a lie. Count Vronsky, her lover, was drawn with colder hands, a hollow man of the aristocratic elite who could ruin a woman's life and still keep his standing at the club. And beneath it all, the railway returned again and again, a dark, thrumming motif of the industrial age tearing through the older rhythms of Russian life. The writing dragged on for 4 long years. Leo's own state began to seep into the pages. Levin's search for faith grew more desperate, because the author's own search was growing more desperate. There came a point in the story when Levin realized he had to hide a rope from himself so that he would not hang himself from the rafters. He stopped carrying a rifle into the woods for fear of what he might do with it. These were not invented fears. The author was writing out his own collapse in the safe harbor of fiction long before he had the language to speak of it plainly in essays. Levin found his fragile salvation at last, not in the doctrines of the church, but in a few simple words spoken by an illiterate peasant on the estate, and this was a quiet foreshadowing of where the writer himself would soon turn. The book ended in 1877, against the backdrop of the Russo-Turkish War, which gave Leo room to mock the manufactured patriotism of the Russian press and the eager nationalism of the aristocracy. And when he set down his pen at last, no relief came. The defenses he had built over a lifetime were gone. He stood at the edge of something vast and dark, unable to find meaning in his art, his family, or any of the achievements the world kept praising him for. What followed was a depression so total that it forced him to take his entire life apart, piece by piece, until only the bare question remained of what a person ought to do with the time they had been given. Chapter 6: The Crisis and a Confession. Leo tried to describe the sensation, and the best he could manage was this. My life had come to a stop. I could breathe, eat, drink, and sleep, and I could not help doing these things. But there was no life, for there were no wishes the fulfillment of which I could consider it reasonable to desire. A full and famous life, emptied from the inside. So he did what he had always done when troubled. He read. He turned first to the exact sciences, hoping that mathematics or biology might have something to say about the soul, and found them eloquent about mechanisms and silent about meaning. Then he turned to philosophy, and philosophy only deepened the pit. Socrates, Schopenhauer, Solomon, the king, and the Buddha, he gathered them around him like witnesses, and each one testified, in his own voice, to the tragedy of being awake. One old Eastern fable lodged itself in him and would not leave. A traveler, fleeing a wild beast, falls into a dry well. At the bottom of the well waits a dragon with its jaws open. The traveler catches at a branch growing from the cracks of the wall and hangs there, suspended, while two mice, one black and one white, gnaw steadily at the root of the branch, day and night, chewing. And there, in his terror, the traveler notices a few drops of honey on the leaves, stretches out his tongue, and licks them. That, Leo decided, was the human condition exactly. The honey, he said, had been his love of family and his love of art. These were the two sweetnesses that had kept his eyes off the dragon for years. Now they soured. His children were simply other travelers in other wells, subject to the same mice, the same jaws. His writing, which had once felt enormous, began to look like vanity, a heap of pages that time would eventually sweep into silence. The two drops of honey which diverted my eyes from the cruel truth longer than the rest, he wrote, my love of family and of writing, art, as I called it, were no longer sweet to me. He looked around at his own class for a way out, and he counted 4. There was ignorance, the refusal to see the well at all, which was no longer available to him once seen. There was hedonism, the cheerful licking of honey while the mice worked, and he found it cowardly. There was the path of strength, which meant suicide, clean and final, and he confessed that he admired the courage of it even as his hand refused. And there was weakness, which was simply hanging on, knowing everything, hoping for nothing, and this was the trap he was in. Then his gaze shifted, almost by accident, away from the drawing rooms and the libraries and out across the fields. Millions of Russian peasants had lived and suffered and died in these same conditions for centuries, and they had not gone mad. They carried their burdens, buried their children, and kept walking. Something in them knew how to live. Whatever it was, the educated classes had lost it, or never had it at all. He began to suspect that reason, followed honestly all the way down, would always end at the conclusion that life was meaningless. If that was so, then the meaning of life had to live somewhere outside reason. He called that somewhere faith, but he meant something stranger and more practical than the word usually carried. Faith is the strength of life, he wrote. If a man lives, he believes in something. If he did not believe that one must live for something, he would not live. For a time, he tried to take that faith whole, in the form his country handed it to him. He went to church, fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays, knelt on cold stone. Let the incense wash over him, the chanting, the old rhythms. He tried to lose himself. Parts of it did soothe him, the repetition, the candlelight, the low voices of the choir. His mind, though, would not stay hushed. The break came, of all places, at the chalice. He could not bring himself to believe, as the liturgy required him to believe, that the small pieces of bread and the wine in the cup had literally become flesh and blood. He described the scene with a strange reporter's flatness. The essence of the service consisted in the supposition that the bits cut up by the priest and put by him into the wine, when manipulated and prayed over in a certain way, turned into the flesh and blood of God. The priest, lifting his arms in the gold cloth, sinking to his knees, waving the cloth softly over the silver saucer and the golden cup. It was supposed that, at this point, the bread and the wine turned into flesh and blood. Therefore, this part of the service was performed with the utmost solemnity. He swallowed the bread. Something inside him refused. He went looking for help. He traveled to the monastery at Optina Pustin, where the famous elder, Father Ambrosi, received seekers from across Russia. Leo wanted a Christianity that could meet a thinking adult on honest ground. What he found were gentle, ascetic men whose world was not quite his world, whose answers pointed inward and upward, while his questions pointed out toward the fields, the law courts, the barracks. He began to see the institution clearly. For centuries, it seemed to him, the Church had taken the strange and dangerous teachings of a wandering Galilean and smoothed them into something the Empire could use. The sharp edges had been filed down. The commandments against killing, against oaths, against wealth, these had been explained away or draped in so much incense that no one could see them anymore. The monks could not help him. Neither could the liturgy, nor the fasts, nor the gold cloth at the altar. He went home to Yasnaya Polyana with the question still open, and with a suspicion forming that the answer, if there was one, was going to have to be found on his own. Chapter 7. The Sermon on the Mount as Political Program. By the early 1880s, the terror had begun to lift, and in its place came a different kind of fever. If faith was to be the ground he stood on, then Leo would know that ground down to its bedrock. He would read the Gospels in the language they were written in, and he would trust no translator and no priest and no council of bishops who had spent centuries smoothing the sharp edges away. And so, at the age of 52, he sat down to learn ancient Greek. He did it in a matter of months, which ought to have been impossible, and read Xenophon and Homer and Plato in the original to catch the exact weight of each word. Hebrew followed soon after. A rabbi was summoned from Moscow and came to the house to sit with him, hour upon hour, working through the mechanics of the Old Testament. The study at Yasnaya Polyana took on the look of a strange workshop. Editions of the Bible lay open across every surface, alongside lexicons and dictionaries and stacks of paper covered in his small, driven hand. He took scissors to the Gospels. He cut them apart, rearranged them, pasted them back together, and built from the fragments a single, harmonized text, stripped of contradiction, stripped of what he now considered debris. The aim, he wrote, was the religion of Christ, but purged of dogma and mystery, a practical religion, not promising future bliss, but providing bliss on earth. Those were his own words, and they described the project exactly. He wanted something a peasant could live by on a Tuesday afternoon. His method was ruthless. When he came to the famous opening of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word," he studied the Greek term logos and refused the mystical translation altogether. He rendered it instead as reasoning or understanding. The foundation shifted beneath the feet of the text. What had been a heavenly mystery became something closer to ordinary thought. Miracles went the same way. There was no virgin birth in his Gospels, no walking on water, no loaves multiplying for the hungry crowd, no body rising from a sealed tomb. Jesus became a traveling teacher, mortal and ethical and political, speaking to human beings about how human beings ought to live. The core of the message, he decided, lay in one place and one place only, the Sermon on the Mount. Not as poetry, not as a set of lovely impossibilities, as law. Binding, literal, and unavoidable law, from which he drew 5 commandments that would form the spine of his book, What I Believe, published in 1884. The first was this: "Do not be angry, live in peace with all men, for anyone angry with his brother, as the gospel has it, shall be subject to judgment." The second was the commandment against lust, which hardened in him over the years into a severe insistence on chastity, until even the intimacy of marriage felt to him like a failure of the spirit. The third commandment forbade the swearing of oaths. "Do not swear at all," the text said, "neither by heaven nor by earth." He took this to mean what it plainly said: no oath to the Tsar, no oath to the army, no oath in any court that called itself a court of justice. The fourth commandment was the one that shook everything: do not resist evil with violence. If a man strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. He read this, and he refused to read it as metaphor. The fifth followed close behind: love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. With that, the very idea of a foreign enemy dissolved. Non-resistance, as he understood it, was not meekness. It was not the bowed head of the beaten servant. It was a deliberate, stubborn refusal to take part in the old cycle of blow answering blow, of punishment answering crime, of war answering war. The Church, he wrote, had spent 1800 years explaining away the plain meaning of these words, and the plain meaning was this: no state could survive them. The collision came in February of 1901. The Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church issued a formal decree of excommunication. Konstantin Pobedonostsev, chief procurator of the Synod and the hard, grey mind behind much of the regime's ideology, understood perfectly well what was at stake. A theology that denied the state the right to kill was a theology the state could not afford. The anathema was read out in cathedrals across the empire. It declared that the old man at Yasnaya Polyana had fallen into religious mania, had severed himself from the faith, and had mocked the holy sacraments. He does not recognize Christian endeavors. The decree went: he laughs at holiness and sacred things. It is he himself he adores, and he bows down before himself like an idol, like a superman. The calculation failed, and it failed spectacularly. In Moscow and in St. Petersburg, the streets filled with people. Students, workers, members of the intelligentsia pressed around his carriage, cheering, throwing flowers. When Ilya Repin's portrait of him went on show in St. Petersburg, the police had to guard it because crowds were gathering beneath the painted face of the excommunicated man and leaving flowers at his feet. His reply to the synod was written with a steady hand. He accepted the excommunication, and he thanked them for it, in a sense, for releasing him from an institution that had for centuries used the name of Christ to bless rifles and gallows and prison gates. The break with the Church was complete. What remained was the state itself, standing there in the open, and he was already turning to face it. Chapter 8. The Kingdom of God is Within You. By the early 1890s, Leo had moved well past the business of annotating scripture. He was building something larger and far more dangerous to the world around him. In 1893, he finished a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. The Russian censors took one look at it and refused to let it near a printing press. So the manuscript was copied out in secret, passed from hand to hand, carried across the border, and published abroad the following year. Within months, it was rattling windows from London to Boston. The argument of the book was simple enough to state and almost impossible to answer. Every modern state, Leo wrote, rested on violence. It did not matter whether the state wore the robes of a Tsar or the suit of an elected president. Underneath the ceremony, there were always the same instruments: a tax collector backed by a policeman, a judge backed by a prison, a general backed by a rifle. Strip the ornament away, and the machinery looked identical. Taxation, he argued, was not a civic contribution. It was extortion, dressed up in paperwork. The laboring poor handed over their coins under threat, and the coins bought the comforts of the rich and the powder for the next war. Conscription was worse. The state took young men from their villages, taught them to kill on command, and called this a patriotic duty. Leo called it temporary slavery, with a uniform thrown in. The courts fared no better under his pen. Judges, juries, chains, executions, all of it existed, he said, to protect property that had been taken in the first place by force. The whole apparatus was revenge wearing the costume of justice. Reading him today, one can feel how carefully he had watched these things over many years from the windows of a very large house. At the emotional heart of the book sat a single scene. Leo described a special train he had seen carrying 400 soldiers armed with rifles. In his own words, and I quote him here, they were, quote, traveling by special train to quell disturbances amongst the starving peasants whom he had been trying to help, end quote. The irony pressed down on every line. The soldiers themselves were peasants. They were being sent into provinces like Tula and Ryazan, where famine had stripped the fields bare, to beat down their own brothers who were asking only for bread. From this, he drew a conclusion that many of his admirers would have preferred he leave unsaid. A Christian who took the Sermon on the Mount seriously could not staff the machinery of the state, not as a soldier, not as a juror, not as a voter. To cast a ballot, in his reading, was to authorize the majority to use force against the minority. It was to sign a check written in someone else's blood. Private property came under the same knife. A great estate, he wrote, could only be held through the standing threat of police and prisons. The hedge around the field was, in the end, a man with a weapon. He was, of course, writing these words while living on one of the largest estates in Russia. He knew the contradiction. It ate at him nightly. The lineage of these ideas reached back many years. In 1861, passing through Brussels, he had met the French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and the older man's suspicion of state and property had stayed with him. The title of War and Peace itself had been lifted, in quiet homage, from Proudhon's own book, La Guerre et la Paix. Later, letters traveled across the Atlantic to the American non-resistants, to Adin Ballou, to the son of William Lloyd Garrison, men who had argued for pacifism in the teeth of slavery. He was careful, though, to mark a line between himself and the revolutionary anarchists of his own time. Bakunin and Kropotkin, with their bombs and their barricades, he could not follow. Violent revolution, he insisted, only swapped one set of armed masters for another. When young radicals came to Yasnaya Polyana, eager to speak of assassinations and righteous terror, he would answer them gently. The officials they wished to kill, he reminded them, were also people. Quote, they too are people, end quote. The sentence was small, and it closed the argument. What, then, was to be done? Not the bomb, not the ballot. Something slower and, in his view, far harder. Millions of ordinary people quietly refusing to pay the tax, refusing to wear the uniform, refusing to serve on the jury or fire the weapon or swear the oath, a state, he believed, could not stand for long once its citizens simply stopped obeying it. He was already beginning to hear back from readers in faraway places who thought he might be right, and one of those letters would soon arrive from a young lawyer in South Africa. Chapter 9. Tolstoy and the World. In a small law office in Johannesburg, a young Indian lawyer opened a book that had travelled halfway across the world to find him. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. The book was called The Kingdom of God is Within You, and by the time he closed it, something in him had shifted for good. He later said of that reading that the book overwhelmed him. It left, in his own words, a permanent impression. Gandhi was not yet the figure we now remember. He was a colonial lawyer in an unjust country, looking for a way to fight without hating. And there, in the pages sent from a Russian estate, he found it. The estate in question was Yasnaya Polyana, and by the 1890s it had become something strange and without precedent. Sacks of letters arrived daily, carried in from every continent. There were notes from American abolitionists, from Indian lawyers, from Japanese translators, from Quakers and Shakers and Unitarians. Leo read them, slowly, carefully, and dictated his replies to a small staff of secretaries who could barely keep pace. He was in his late 60s now, with a long white beard and a peasant smock, and he was running from a farmhouse in rural Russia what can only be described as a global ministry. Some of his readers could not bear to stay where they were after finishing his books. An American diplomat named Ernest Howard Crosby, stationed in Alexandria, picked up a French translation of a slim philosophical tract called On Life. By the final page, his career was over. He resigned his post, boarded a train, and made his way to Yasnaya Polyana to meet the man himself. He returned to the United States a convert and spent the rest of his life as Leo's chief American disciple. The social reformer Jane Addams made a similar pilgrimage in 1896, and later said the visit had seeded her settlement housework in Chicago. While the pilgrims came and went, a more desperate story was unfolding in the far south of the empire. The Doukhobors were a peasant sect who had broken entirely from the Orthodox Church. They kept no priests, no icons, no rituals. They read the Bible among themselves and held the life of every human being as sacred and refused absolutely to take up arms. The Tsarist government had already exiled them once, in the 1830s, to the bleak borderlands of the Caucasus. A new leader rose among them in the 1890s, a man called Pyotr Verigin, writing from his own Siberian exile. He instructed his followers to give up meat, tobacco, and drink, and to refuse the oath of allegiance to the new Tsar, Nicholas II. On the night of the 28th of June, 1895, the Doukhobors did something extraordinary. They gathered every gun and every sword they owned, piled them together, poured kerosene over the heap, and lit it. They sang psalms as the weapons burned. The Cossacks came soon after with lead-tipped whips and left 4,000 of them bloodied and broken, exiled into the fever valleys of Georgia. Word of what had happened reached Yasnaya Polyana through a follower named Prince Khilkov. Leo responded with the full force of his fame. He drafted, with his close disciples Chetkov and Biryukov, a public appeal titled, simply Help. The Russian censors would never have let it pass, so the text was smuggled to England and printed there in early 1897. Chetkov was exiled for his trouble. Leo himself was untouchable, protected by the sheer scale of his international reputation. Moving 4,000 pacifists out of a hostile empire, however, required money on a scale no appeal could raise. Leo had in his drawer the half-finished manuscript of a novel he had been working on for years. It was called Resurrection. He pledged every ruble of its future earnings to the Doukhobor cause. The book appeared serially in an illustrated weekly in 1899, and he waived his international copyrights so that the profits could flow in unimpeded. Quakers in England gave generously. Moscow merchants contributed. A small English commune at Purley gave so much it nearly bankrupted itself. Between December of 1898 and May of 1899, more than 7,500 Doukhobors sailed for Canada on chartered ships. The greatest living novelist had sold his own novel to buy their freedom. Visitors kept arriving, and they kept writing down what they saw. The Japanese writer Tokutomi Roka came in 1906 and stayed 5 days. He noted the silver watch on its chain, the pencil and notebook always in the pocket, the vegetarian meals taken under the big maple outside the house, and the 4 dogs that followed the family about. There was a white Siberian, a brown pointer, a black setter, and a black and white spaniel. Tokutomi went home and wrote about all of it. And then there was Gandhi, still in South Africa, still reading. The correspondence between the two men began in 1909 and continued until Leo's death. Gandhi founded a cooperative farm outside Johannesburg and named it Tolstoy Farm in plain tribute. The entire practice of satyagraha, non-violent resistance to imperial power, rested on what he had absorbed from those Russian pages. A Finnish lawyer named Arvid Jernefelt had already done something similar in his own country, abandoning his profession to become a farmer and a cobbler, translating the tracts into Finnish. The doctrine traveled wherever a reader was willing to be undone by it. All of this, the letters, the Doukhobors, the farm outside Johannesburg, ran alongside something else happening inside Leo himself. The novelist who had once written vast historical panoramas was disappearing. In his place, a harder, leaner writer was emerging, one who wanted to strip prose back to the bone and use it like a surgeon's knife on the hypocrisies of the modern world. Chapter 10. Resurrection, the death of Ivan Ilyich, and art after conversion. There is a stubborn rumor, repeated for more than a century now, that the conversion ruined Leo as a novelist, that the sermonizer had strangled the storyteller in his sleep. Anyone who has read the books he wrote after the crisis knows this to be nonsense. The late fiction is leaner, stranger, and sharper than anything he had written before. Take the small, terrible book he finished in 1886, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Its protagonist is a judge of middling talent and tidy ambitions, a man who has arranged his life exactly as a man of his class is expected to. He takes a fall from a stepladder while hanging curtains in a new apartment. The bruise becomes a pain, the pain becomes an illness, and the illness slowly dismantles everything he thought his life amounted to. The doctors arrive in their black coats and speak to him in the same pompous, knowing tones he himself had used for years from the bench. They say a great deal and mean almost nothing. His wife sighs at the inconvenience of his dying. Only Gerasim, the young peasant who cleans for the household, will look him in the face and admit what is happening. Gerasim holds the dying man's legs on his shoulders through the night because it eases the pain and because that is what one does for another person. 3 years later came the Kreutzer Sonata, which caused a scandal of a very different order. The whole story takes place inside a moving train carriage, a confession spilled out by a man named Poznishev to a stranger who cannot leave. He tells how he married within the polite ritual of his class, which he now describes as a sanctioned form of prostitution dressed in white lace. He tells how jealousy of a violinist who played Beethoven with his wife ended with a Damascus dagger and her body on the floor. The censors banned it outright. Sophia herself traveled to Petersburg and petitioned the Tsar to allow its publication in her husband's collected works. In the same years, Leo was secretly writing something altogether different, a story he kept hidden even from his closest disciples. Haji Marat was drafted between 1896 and 1904, a return at the end of his life to the mountains he had first seen as a young artillery officer. The novella follows an Avar commander who defects from Imam Shamil and throws himself upon the mercy of the Russian army, only to find both sides prepared to destroy him. The forestry and pacification campaigns in Chechnya are described with cold fury. Tsar Nicholas I appears in a portrait so scathing it is almost comic, a vain man puffed up by his own reflection. A severed head stands in at the close for the whole imperial enterprise. Then there was Resurrection, the last of the long novels and the most openly political thing he ever published. A nobleman named Prince Nekhlyudov is called to sit on a jury and recognizes the accused. She is Katyusha Maslova, a peasant girl he had seduced and abandoned years before, now on trial for a murder she did not commit. A clerical slip by the bored jurors sends her to hard labor in Siberia. Nekhlyudov follows her. He hands his land over to the peasants who work it after the single tax ideas of Henry George, and walks behind the prisoners on the long road east. Convicts drop from sunstroke in the Moscow heat while guards consult their protocols. The prison Eucharist scene in Resurrection was written with the exact same cold, reporter's flatness he had developed years earlier. When the Holy Synod read those pages, it gave them the final ammunition they needed to pull the trigger on his excommunication. All of this rested on a theory of art Leo had been refining for 15 years, finally published as What is Art in 1897. He argued that most of what the wealthy classes called culture was counterfeit, designed to titillate jaded nerves. He devoted an entire chapter to dismantling Wagner's Siegfried. Real art, he wrote, is an infection. The artist feels something, and through his work the reader or listener catches that same feeling, as one catches a cold in a crowded room. He pointed to a Vogel hunter in Siberia miming a deer hunt for his village as an example of the genuine article. He consigned his own early novels to the dustbin of bad art and meant it. The style of the late stories follows the theory exactly. Gone are the long digressions, the lavish ballroom scenes, the Homeric similes. The prose is pared down, economical, and unsparingly direct. He used the old device of defamiliarization, which is simply refusing to call a thing by its accepted name, so that courts, operas, and liturgies appear as the odd human behaviors they in fact are. Many of the late pieces are short moral fables written for a peasant publishing house called Posrednik, which means the intermediary. How much land does a man need tells you its answer in its title, if you are willing to read to the end. What held the late work together was a single conviction. The state, the church, the courts, the marriage market, and the army were all machines for dressing up violence as respectability. Salvation, such as it was, lay in giving away what you had, doing physical work with your hands, and refusing to harm another person under any circumstance whatsoever. The fiction and the tracts were saying the same thing in different registers. And readers took him at his word, all over Russia and soon beyond it, ordinary people began quietly packing up their lives to try to live the doctrine out in full. Chapter 11. Communes, Followers, and Contradictions. The doctrines that had been smuggled out of Russia found willing hands in places the writer himself would never visit. A movement began to take shape, spreading outwards from Yasnaya Polyana like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. In Britain and the Netherlands, in Bulgaria and South Africa, in the fields of the American Midwest, small groups of followers gathered themselves together and tried to live as the Master had taught. They grew vegetables. They refused meat. They abstained from the bedroom, or tried to. They turned their backs on money where they could, and they would not serve in any army, under any flag, for any reason at all. One of the earliest was a former Russian revolutionary named Vladimir Gaines, who had fled the empire and remade himself under the name William Frey. Frey settled in Cedarville, Kansas, where he founded a strict vegetarian commune and held all property in common with his fellow colonists. In time, he traveled back across the ocean to see the old man for himself. The two spent long hours together at Yasnaya Polyana, talking over the ethics of the plate and the soul of the body. By the end of those conversations, Leo had given up meat entirely and would not eat it again. In England, the movement found another passionate voice in a man called John Kenworthy, who founded the Croydon Brotherhood Church and then, sometime later, an agricultural colony at Purley in Essex. The English colonists tilled their small plot of land, printed radical tracts on cheap presses, and helped gather the funds we mentioned earlier, the money that finally secured the Doukhobors passage to Canada. Purley became a kind of way station for Russian exiles and a clearinghouse for banned literature that had been carried in secret out of the empire. The trouble was that farming is hard, and faith rarely fills a stomach. Most of these communes collapsed within a few years of opening their gates. The members had read many books and owned few practical skills, and more than one colony came within sight of starvation before it was finally dissolved. The ideological arguments were endless. Grown men and women sat up late into the night debating whether animal manure might be used on the vegetables or whether a pair of leather boots made a mockery of everything they claimed to believe. In Russia itself, the cost of these convictions was paid in a much harder currency. The state had no patience for young men who refused the draft, and it punished them without mercy. Conscientious objectors were thrown into military prisons, beaten, and sent off to the furthest and coldest corners of Siberia. A number of them died there, far from home. For the sake of a principle their master had written down in a book, their suffering did not vanish with them. It passed, in time, into the conscience of the next century. And all the while, at the heart of the movement, there lived a contradiction that no amount of writing could dissolve. The man who preached poverty still lived on a great estate. The man who called private property a sin still slept beneath the roof of a house he had been born into. Servants in white gloves still carried dishes to his table. Leo tried, in his later years, to close the gap between what he said and what he did. He wore the loose shirt of a peasant. He learned to make his own boots at a cobbler's bench. He carried his own water from the well, swept his own room, and went out into the fields at harvest time with a scythe in his hands. Yet the estate went on feeding him, and he knew it. Yasnaya Polyana had become something close to a battlefield of ideas, with disciples watching every exchange between the writer and his wife, taking notes on her failures of faith. The peasants of the village watched all of this with a knowing eye. They saw the city intellectuals in their borrowed blouses, working the fields with soft hands, and they understood that these visitors could always go home when the cold came. Inside the house, the old man began keeping a second diary, a private one, hidden from both his wife and his followers, where he set down the full measure of his despair and his sense of being trapped inside the walls of his own teaching. But the battle lines at Yasnaya Polyana had been drawn long before the first disciples ever arrived. The true siege of Yasnaya Polyana had been gathering force for decades, driven entirely by the tension inside the house. Chapter 12. Sophia, Love, and Mutual Destruction. To understand the collapse of the Union, you have to remember the scale of what was being destroyed. The early years at the estate had been crowded and collaborative, bound up in the shared labor of raising the surviving children and pulling the great novels into the world. The fracture only really opened at the end of the 1870s, during his years of terror, when he hid the rope and gave up his gun. Leo emerged from that darkness a different man, and she could only watch him change. In the January of 1881, she wrote that he had, as he put it, recognized the light. She described him sitting at his books until dinner, grown thin and grey over the winter, absorbed and silent, no longer capable of the old gladness that had once filled the house. The suffering of strangers, she wrote, seared his existence. What had been a private sorrow soon became a daily argument over bread and land and money. He wanted to give the estate to the peasants, renounce the copyrights, and walk into poverty with his family behind him. Sonia refused. She had children to feed and educate, and she would not watch them driven into destitution to prove a point of doctrine. In the summer of 1884, he packed a bag and set out for Tula, turning back only when word reached him that she had gone into labor with their daughter Alexandra. 8 years later, a compromise was struck. He signed the property over to his wife and their heirs, divesting himself on paper of the wealth he could not bear, while leaving her the means to keep the children clothed. It resolved nothing. The house at Yasnaya Polyana had already been invaded by a new presence, and his name was Vladimir Chertkov, a former guards officer who had given up his commission for a life of moral severity. He arrived in the autumn of 1883 and stayed, in one form or another, until the end. Sonia saw Leo at once for what he was. He was the disciple who would take her husband from her, not through affection but through ideology, by making himself indispensable to the work. He founded a press, took charge of the new writings, and gathered around the old man a circle Sonia called the Dark Ones. The diaries that had once been their shared confession became weapons. She read his to find evidence of his cruelty. He wrote in hers knowing she would read it, and asked Chertkov to destroy the earlier ones so she could not. Chertkov kept them. When their 7-year-old Vanya died of scarlet fever in the February of 1895, whatever was left between them buckled. Sonia threw herself into music and developed a desperate attachment to the composer Sergei Taneyev, a man 12 years her junior. There was nothing physical in it, and her husband knew as much, but the jealousy settled in him like a slow fever. In the July of 97, he wrote her a long farewell letter, slipped it inside the upholstery of an armchair in his study, and did not leave. He told a friend that the only thing holding him there was the fear she would kill herself if he went. The final decade was a long, exhausting siege. Leo confided to his diary that he wanted to suffer, and the house obliged him. Sonia searched his study at night by candlelight, reading whatever papers she could find. She accused him of unnatural feelings for Chertkov. She sent his manuscripts to the Historical Museum in Moscow to keep them beyond the disciples' reach. In the autumn of 1909, under relentless pressure, he signed a secret will that placed his writings in the hands of their youngest daughter Alexandra, who had chosen Chertkov's side. Sonia was not told. She would find out, as she found out everything now, too late. The house had become unlivable. The searches in the dark, the whispered conferences with disciples in corridors, the secret will pressing on his conscience, the wife he still loved and could no longer bear. He had spent 30 years preaching that a man should own nothing and harm no one, and he was sleeping each night beneath the carved ceilings of an inherited manor, waited on by servants, watched by a woman who loved him and read his papers by lamplight. And so the pressure grew and grew, until at last, in the small hours of an October night, the 82-year-old man rose from his bed and fled the only home he had ever known. Chapter 13. The Flight and the Death. As he made his preparations to leave, he woke his doctor, Dushan Makovitsky, a devoted follower who wrote down nearly every word his master spoke. Leo told him, very simply, that they were leaving at once, in secret, and that he would not be coming back. His heart was weak, and he had been fainting often in the preceding months, making the journey immediately dangerous. He packed by candlelight, a few shirts, notebooks, pens, his diaries. On the table, a letter for Sophia asking her not to follow, explaining that an old man had the right to withdraw from the world and spend his last days in peace, a right he'd never quite claimed when he had the health to walk away with dignity. He slipped out into the wet autumn grounds, losing his cap in the dark brush somewhere between the house and the stables. He and Makovitsky woke the coachman. The carriage was harnessed, and they drove through the freezing pre-dawn to the little station at Shchekino, where they bought tickets in third class, hoping to pass unnoticed among the peasants crowded onto the wooden benches. He had no clear destination. He went first to the monastery at Optina Pustin, a place he had visited before during his years of crisis. He spoke with the elders there, as he had done in the past, and found no lasting comfort. From there he travelled on to the small convent at Shamordino, where his sister Maria had long lived as a nun. They sat together for several hours. He spoke, quite seriously, of renting a peasant hut nearby, of living out his last days in the sort of obscure poverty he had written about for decades. But the fear that Sophia would find him there and bring him home would not leave him alone. So he went back to the trains. His youngest daughter, Alexandra, joined him along the way, and the three of them travelled south, perhaps toward the Caucasus, perhaps toward one of the small Tolstoyan settlements near the Black Sea. Nobody was quite sure. The cold, unheated third-class carriages did the rest of the work. On the 31st of October, somewhere on the moving train, he was seized by violent shivering, and his fever rose sharply. Makovitsky examined him and said what no one wanted to hear. It was pneumonia, and it was serious. They had to get him off the train at the next stop, whatever the next stop happened to be. The next stop was a place called Astapovo, a tiny railway junction, lost in the flat steppe, the kind of place no traveller ever meant to visit. The station master, a man named Ivan Ozelin, saw who had collapsed onto his platform. He cleared out his own small red wooden house, and he gave up his own bed to the dying man. And there, in a borrowed room in a stranger's home, beside the tracks, Leo began his last week on Earth. Word got out within hours. What followed at that forgotten junction was something the world had never quite seen before. Reporters from Paris and London and Berlin arrived by the trainload. The telegraph wires ran hot day and night. Pathé set up its newsreel cameras on the platform, filming anyone who stepped down from an arriving carriage. The Russian state, terrified that his death might spark the countryside into open revolt, sent gendarmes and plainclothes police to mingle with the crowds and wire reports back to St. Petersburg. The Holy Synod, which had excommunicated him almost a decade earlier, now dispatched a priest, Father Varsonofy, to the station, hoping for a deathbed reconciliation that might undo everything he had written against the church. Chertkov and the inner circle bolted the door of the little house, and the priest was never admitted. A special train arrived bearing Sophia and several of her older children. And then came the cruelest thing of all. She was not allowed inside. For days she walked the frozen platform, 48 years of marriage standing behind her, peering in through the frosted window of a station master's cottage, hoping to see her husband's face. The newsreel cameras filmed her walking there in the snow. The woman who had copied out War and Peace by hand 7 times was locked out of the room where her husband lay dying. Inside, the pneumonia took what was left of him. He drifted in and out, dictating fragments to his daughters, speaking of peasants and of God and of the truth, never of his novels. He refused medicine. He asked only to be allowed to die naturally. In his final hours, when he had slipped into a coma and could no longer be disturbed by her presence, Sophia was at last let into the room. She knelt beside the bed and whispered into the ear of a man who could no longer hear her. Early on the morning of November the 7th, by the old Russian calendar, the breathing simply stopped. They put Leo in a plain wooden coffin and sent him home by train. What happened at Yasnaya Polyana then had no precedent in the Russian Empire. Thousands came, despite the police, despite the church's ban, despite the cold. Peasants, students, workers, and city intellectuals walked together through the mud of the estate. There were no priests. There were no icons, no incense, no prayers for the soul of the departed. The immense crowd carried the coffin in silence through the woods toward a spot he had spoken of since he was a small boy. It was the place where his older brother had once buried that little green stick on which was written the secret of universal human brotherhood. When the procession reached that spot, the crowd sank to its knees in the snow and began to sing the old folk hymn, Eternal Memory, without accompaniment, without clergy, with nothing between the voices and the trees. The coffin went into the frozen ground. Silence. The lowering of that plain wooden box, without a single prayer spoken over it, marked a release rather than an end. The ideas he had worked out in his study, the ideas that had driven his wife to despair and the Tsar to dispatch spies and the Synod to dispatch priests, were already loose in the world. They had crossed borders while he was still alive. They were about to cross oceans. Chapter 14. Why Tolstoy Still Matters. The estate emptied quickly after the funeral. Family and friends drifted away, and Sophia was left to document the steady stream of visitors who still came. Journalists. A group of 52 female students from St. Petersburg. A Muslim man from the Caucasus who arrived carrying a wreath. She wrote directly to Tsar Nicholas II, warning that her sons might be forced to sell the property. She hoped the heart of the Russian nation would not fall into private hands. The Tsar's response came on December 20th, a blunt internal memo declaring that any government purchase was strictly inadmissible. The family tried other schemes. They floated the idea of selling plots to the pacifist Doukhobors in Canada, but the sect didn't have the funds. Land was sold in pieces, the estate slowly shrinking around the main house like a coat that no longer fit. Then the war came. August 1914, fractured everything. One son was drafted into the military. Another went to work for the Red Cross. The youngest daughter headed for the front lines as a combat nurse. The followers of the non-violent philosophy did not go quietly. They circulated an illegal anti-war manifesto called "Come to Your Senses, Brothers." It urged Russian soldiers to love all human beings in uniform, regardless of which side they fought for. The Tsarist government responded with an early morning raid on a Moscow house in January 1915. They arrested Valentin Bulgakov, Tolstoy's personal secretary, along with 26 other conscientious objectors. These men spent 13 months in the Tula jail before family members posted bail and British contacts pressured the government to back down. When the Romanov dynasty collapsed in February 1917, state censorship vanished overnight. Followers immediately began unearthing the vast cache of banned religious and political writings. They published them openly, finally, after decades of suppression. The Bolsheviks seized power that October, and the pacifist disciples walked the dangerous streets of Moscow, distributing leaflets. The leaflets read, "Stop the fratricide." They prioritized the message over their own safety. Vladimir Lenin recognized the cultural weight of what he was dealing with. In January 1918, he personally intervened to mandate a state-sponsored publication of the complete collected works. The archive contained 2.5 million pages, and Lenin treated it as a matter of supreme state importance. The Moscow Museum was nationalized and installed in a handsome mansion. The country estate became a state-run commune, complete with a school, a library, and a hospital. The youngest daughter, acting as custodian, secured the arrangement during a meeting with Mikhail Kalinin. She arrived at the Kremlin gates, riding her bicycle straight from the train station. The Civil War years became something unexpected, a golden age for the movement. Agricultural communes sprang up across the country. Followers engaged in massive public debates against Bolshevik leaders in Moscow's Polytechnical Museum. The tolerance did not last. Stalinist suppression dismantled the communes systematically. The Life and Labor Commune, which had relocated to Siberia in 1930, was ruthlessly broken apart by regional authorities. By its final meeting in January 1939, mass arrests had left barely any men standing. Survivors were transferred to state farms, where they lived in extreme poverty. Decades later, a 71-year-old invalid from that Siberian commune wrote a defiant letter to the Soviet government. He demanded rehabilitation, not for himself, but so that young prosecutors should learn what was done to the friends and followers of the movement. The global reach of this philosophy was vast. Rosa Luxemburg praised the criticism of the existing order as radically uncompromising, noting that it knew absolutely no limits. During the trench warfare of World War I, Ludwig Wittgenstein found a copy of the Gospel in Brief in a Galician bookshop. He later said that distilled anti-dogmatic text had virtually kept him alive. In India, his correspondence, Mahatma Gandhi, cemented non-violent resistance as a primary tool for civil rights and anti-colonial movements across the world. In Atlanta, a young theology student searching for a way to answer the violence done to his people sat listening to a lecture on Gandhi and began to follow the thread backwards. Martin Luther King Jr. found, at the far end of it, a Russian novelist he had never expected to meet. The marches in Selma, the long boycott in Montgomery, the refusal to strike back when struck, all of it carried, in its deep structure, the strange militant reading of the Sermon on the Mount that Leo had set down in What I Believe. What remains, in our own century of drones and algorithms and warming seas, is something stranger than a doctrine. Tolstoy had taken the figure of Jesus, stripped away the miracles and the metaphysics, and left behind a teacher with a handful of very plain instructions. Do not swear oaths to governments. Do not pile up wealth. Do not answer a blow with a blow. He believed these sentences were meant to be obeyed, literally, on ordinary afternoons, by ordinary people. And he had tried. That was the unbearable part. He had taken his own life apart to see if the thing could actually be done, and the cost had been more or less everything. His standing among the literary elite, the peace of his household, the love of the woman who had copied his sentences by candlelight for half a century. He died in a station master's bed, far from home, and the world has been quarreling with him and borrowing from him ever since.